Question for you. Are you ready for a new series? Because this is week 1 of I Have Questions. If you're anything like me, chances are you probably have a lot of questions about a lot of different things. Like, is there really life on Mars? Who invented homework? Not a fan of that guy. And why is McDonald's ice cream machine literally always broken? You know what I'm talking about. Another question I have is, who decided that we go to school for 5 days and we get a 2-day break? These questions are just ridiculous, and they're kind of ones I've been stuck on for a while. And in this series, what we're doing is we're taking those tough questions that you may have been stuck on about your faith, and we're diving in. So today's question is, when people are hurting, where is God? Because the sad reality is, from the beginning of time, people have been hurting, people have been suffering, people have been just in pain. We see it throughout our society. We saw it with the Holocaust, with slavery, with countless wars, with pandemics, so many different things. And in these times, it's easy to feel like there's no hope, to feel like we've been abandoned. Some of you may have seen these tragedies and thought, where was God when this was happening? Or maybe it's a personal thing. Maybe it's a tragedy that you experienced that left you just feeling so hurt, so lost, and so abandoned. For me, it was when I lost my dad. I was a senior in high school. I was 17 years old, and when I lost him, it was just, I felt lost. I didn't know what to feel or what to think. I just remember being filled with so much anger and so much pain and hurt. And I remember thinking, if God's real, why is this happening to me? Where is he right now? Why am I so alone? I'm sitting there thinking, where is God? You may have felt that same way. But I want you to remember that question, where is God? Because we're gonna be digging into an Old Testament book, a story in the book of Esther. And in this story, I want you to remember, where is God? So before we dig into this, let's look at a few key players in the mix. One, we obviously have Esther. Esther is a young Jewish woman who was chosen to be the queen of Persia. And that's important. She's Jewish, but no one knew she was Jewish. We'll come back to that. The next guy is a dude named Haman. Now, Haman, he's a turd. He is the right-hand man of the king. He is a key advisor to the king. And he's also a very racist and hateful politician who actually comes up with this plan to just murder all the Jews in all of Persia. And for some reason, the king's like, yes, sir, let's go. And then the third guy is a dude named Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's cousin, and he hears about this plan. And he tells Esther, hey, listen, we have to do something. And that's the queen. So he's like, listen, you gotta go and talk to the king. That might not sound like a big deal, right? I mean, my wife talks to me and that's a normal thing. But in these times, that's a big deal. Because if you speak to the king without permission, you can be sentenced to death. Let's read about that. We read about it in Esther chapter 4. It says, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gives Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go and gather all of the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same, and then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. That's a big deal. That's a big step. That's a dangerous step. Imagine what Esther is feeling in this moment. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of hurting people out there that could possibly die. And she's carrying this weight on her shoulders to do something about it. and she knows that she has to proceed with caution. So she comes up with this plan. It's a pretty simple plan, actually. She says, I'm gonna invite the king to a feast and I'm gonna make my request. So they go to one feast and she decides, I'm gonna change the plan a little bit. I'm gonna do a second feast, but I'm just gonna have the king and Haman. So the second feast comes along and then things get interesting. Let's look at that. This happens in chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbana, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Whoa. So a lot kind of happened there, and that was pretty intense. But ultimately, it got the job done. Haman the turd was punished, and the Jewish people were saved, and justice was served. Now, let's look at this though with that same question of, where was God when all of this stuff was happening? Because see, that's an interesting question, especially in the context of the book of Esther. Because through the entire book, God's not mentioned one time. So that's got us asking again, where is God? Well, I wrote down 3 things to help us remember. Number 1 is God is present. God is invisible. So we don't see him, but that doesn't mean he's not there. And just because we choose not to acknowledge him sometime, that does not mean that he's abandoned us. God was still there. Number 2, God is working. Because see, God works all things out for the good of his people. In this scenario, the Jewish people, those are God's people. Haman, he's a turd. So God did what God does, and he worked everything out on his timing. Then the third thing is that God was working through Esther. See, the closest that we get to a mention of God in the book of Esther is when she had her people fast. Because when you fast, you don't eat, you get hungry, and then you use that time to pray and grow closer to the Lord. And through that, God provided for Esther. He gave her strength, he gave her wisdom, gave her discernment and confidence and courage and guidance and so many different things to equip her to get the job done. It wasn't easy, but God never left. And in reality, you guys are gonna face a lot of things that are not easy. Sometimes you're gonna face things that are just full of pain, full of suffering. It could be just for you, it could be for a group of people. Whatever it is, you're gonna face challenging times. But it's so important that you remember these 3 things, they remain true for you today. 1, God is present. 2, God is working. And 3, God wants to work through you. It's a big deal. But sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes it's a struggle. Life can get heavy. And if you've ever lifted weights, you know that when you go heavy on your weight, you need a spotter. And as you can see, this is a 100-pound dumbbell. This thing is super heavy. And this right here is gonna represent the weight of whatever situation you're faced with. Whether it's a personal situation or something that is going to matter for other people, it's gonna be heavy. It's gonna be a challenge, but you still have to deal with it. You still have to lift it. So, let's see what that looks like. Just like that. When you deal with these heavy things, these stressful things, God doesn't just walk away and leave you alone to deal with them. Just like with Esther, He provided what she needed to get the job done. So when you're struggling and you're trying your best to get through something, again, whether it's for you or whether it's for someone else, God sees it and God helps you. God is your spotter when life gets heavy. So I want to leave you guys with these 3 things. Remember these 3 things. 1, God is present, whether you acknowledge Him or not. 2, God is working for His people. You are His people. And 3, God wants to work through you. The question is, will you let Him? Because who knows? Maybe you're going through this exact situation for a reason, just like Esther did. I love you guys. Have a great week.